My topic this afternoon is monads, brains, and quantum computing. And actually, that dates back to a book of mine which was published exactly 30 years ago. And in that book, I already considered the origin of modern mathematical logic, of modern artificial intelligence, and digital computing in Leibniz. And in that book, I also considered the inspiration of Leibniz Monadology for the modern theory of automata and neural network. So the talk will be this book revisited after 30 years, but under the new aspects of quantum computing and machine learning. So I will start from monads to quantum cellular automata, then from monads to a quantum neural network, and towards the monadic quantum brain. And that has something to do with modern technology, and therefore always this famous slogan of Leibniz, Theoria cum praxi. From monads to cellular automata. This is the first page, handwritten by Leibniz. Typical Leibniz here. And here in the first paragraphs, he distinguished between simple substances and composed substances. And composed substances consisting of many simple substances. And from a modern point of view, mathematically, I prefer to call them simple systems and complex systems. And these complex systems and the simple systems are distinguished and characterized by states, here in the Leibniz French, l'état. And then these states are changing in time. And nowadays in physics we call that phase or state transition. Here in French, le sujet au changement. Now the famous paragraph 64 in Monadology, every organic body of a living being is a kind of divine machine or natural automaton, surpassing all artificial automata infinitely. And that is now and was my inspiration for cellular automata. And the concept of cellular automata was historically introduced by John von Neumann and his great German competitor in the invention of the first digital computer. That was Konrad Zuse. And cellular automata are complex systems of finite automata, cells, and these you can imagine a checkerboard with these cells, and each cell is characterized with a number, the number indicating the state, and which change in dependence of only the distribution of states in the neighborhood. That means only by simple local laws. And there is no central processor, but self-organization. It is amazing how special cellular automata can reproduce themselves in sequential generation. It looks like the emergence of a population of viruses by cell definition. Every computer, digital computer, can be simulated by an appropriate cellular automaton and vice versa, in the sense of the Turing machine. Now, every complex dynamical system can be considered an automaton. For example, complex system in physics, complex atomic system, or in chemistry, a molecular system, or in biology, cellular systems. And simple examples are illustrated here with input, output, and the feedback loops as connections. This is a network of automata with feedback loops. And mathematically, it can characterize by a functional equation, in the sense that an output is a function value of a certain input. So every dynamical system can be characterized by functional equations, and that is the idea today in natural sciences. The dynamical systems can be characterized by natural laws. That means by equation. And any cellular automaton can be understood as a classical dynamical system. For example, here an automaton with 3 inputs, a state and the output, and the dynamics, the phase transition, is characterized by a functional equation depending on these inputs and the state, and then the output is a uniquely determined state. And if we consider these variables as real numbers and the function as a real valued function, then we get concerning the change of the state a differential equation. And the differential equation is the modern representation of a natural law. And it is absolutely amazing how very simple local rules can lead to complex structures. That is illustrated here. And remember the checkerboard. And now the simplest case is that an automaton is developing line by line in time. And each cell, here very small, each cell, the state of a cell, depend on 3 preceding cells here. And then we only consider 2 states, black and white, 0 and 1, and the choice of the outputs. And they are represented here by the numbers 0 and 1, and we get binary numbers. Binary numbers, invention of Leibniz. And this is the encoding in decimal numbers. These decimal numbers are the code, the DNA of a cellular automaton. It is amazing. You cannot see it here in these simple laws, how different patterns can emerge, completely regular patterns, completely symmetric patterns, turbulence, and even chaos. And today, with the computer power, you can generate unbelievable large pattern formation, and then you can try to classify these different patterns. For example, here's a first class equilibrium state. After some steps, the development with end in equilibrium. For example, in nature, a fluid phase transition, and after some time, crystallization. No change. Or here, second class oscillation, repeating of patterns, a wave in nature. Or here, a chaotic, turbulent development, or complex structures. It seems to be like growing plants. And in the last cases, the development depends on tiny changes in the beginning. That means tiny changes in the long run can lead to different complex structures. So in that sense, these dynamical systems are not resilient. And Stephen Wolfram, perhaps you know, recommended American mathematician and successful entrepreneur with the Mathematica software. He came up in the beginning of 2000 with the idea of a new kind of science. He said, although he was a trained mathematical physicist, he said, we will no longer use natural laws. We will not longer use equations. That means future prediction by solving very complicated equations. We only need our data and then computer power, the local rules, and then our computer will run faster than nature. Perhaps weather prediction. Weather prediction. We start with that. We let run them, and today we can see the weather of tomorrow, but of course with some probability. Anyway, and that was criticized by us. And we argued against that, claiming for the traditional Newtonian, Einsteinian view and the advantage of mathematical theory and mathematical equations. Why? Wolfram was very proud that he found by his quasi-computer experiments a distinguished cellular automata, namely a so-called universal automaton, 110, and with the code name. And universal automaton is like universal Turing machine. That means an automata which can simulate all other automata. But what we did, we proved rigorously, mathematically, there is not only one, there are exactly 4 automata, not more. Why? We considered the equations, so to say, the natural laws here of these automata, and we found they are invariant with respect to certain symmetry transformation, and that is, so to say, the holy grail of the universe of automata. There is a symmetry group which distinguished these automata, and that is, by the way, quite similar to physics. That is quite similar to the physical universe, because in the standard theory of the physical universe, there are the fundamental laws distinguished by symmetry groups. And that is, so to say, the holy grail in modern physics, and that has something to do with Leibniz. Because Leibniz had the idea that in each monad, the whole universe is reflected. And that is true, exactly, in a rigorous sense, for the universal automata, because they can simulate all kinds of other automata in the world. And with that, we started to describe, at least in a classical simulation, elementary particle physics. You know, there are annihilation and generation of particles. For example, here in a Feynman diagram, it is illustrated. This may be the red arrow, an electron and a positron, and they meet, and then annihilation, resulting in a scattering gamma ray. And that is simulated here with this distinguished, perhaps you can see it, that is here in the representation, a little bit difficult. Perhaps you can see it here exactly, the reconstruction. And the background, the checker point here, represents the vacuum condensate in the quantum field. But that is only a classical mimicking, such as the Feynman diagram. That's only a classical mimicking. But what we need is a quantum cellular automaton. And of course, that would mean there is no uniquely determined cellular state, but there is a quantum probabilistic distribution, or a quantum amplitude of the state 0 and 1. And in the end, you can prove that quantum cellular automata can be characterized by transition rules which correspond to unitary transformations. That's only for the specialists, but it should highlight it is possible to do that. So what the quintessence here is that in the simple toy world, I want to call it toy world of the automata, we can already study essential features of the physical universe with relation to Leibniz. Now from monads to quantum dual network. And here again I start with Leibniz, and here paragraph 17, here in the quotation, Leibniz was wondering how the whole, the mind, can emerge from interacting elements. In his famous example, if we enter a mill, we only see the interacting gears here. And if you come to the brain you have the neurons. The neurons are neurochemically interacting, and the neurons cannot think, they cannot feel, and so on. But under certain conditions, these cell assemblies emerge of interacting cells. And that can be illustrated in medicine nowadays with measurements of PET, positron emission tomography. And these cell assemblies are correlated with different mental and cognitive states, for example, perceptions, emotions, thoughts, and consciousness. And the interactions of the neurons nowadays in machine learning represented by neural networks. Very simple, the nodes in the graph represent the neurons, the The arrows represent the synaptic interaction weighted by numbers, indicating the intensity of the neurochemical signals. And then such a neuron is said to fire or to be excited if, and that's a local rule, if the input of the neighbored weighted cells is larger than a certain threshold value. And by that, you get a sequence of signals led here through the architecture of the neural network, triggered by so-called learning algorithms. And a very simple example, supervised learning means that at first the system is trained by some pattern, the face, pixels, and then it is able to recognize by approximation this trained face. Now, if we only consider one layer in the neural network, that is quite similar to the cellular automata. For example, here in physics, you consider a piece of iron, a ferromagnet. It's a complex system consisting of simple dipoles, atomic dipoles, with two states. And here it is in this order. And then by phase transition, that means annealing the system, it ends in a regular structure. Order emerge. That means the dipoles are aligned in one direction. They enforce themselves as atomic magnets, and then the whole system is magnetized. And John Hopfield, he was a solid-state physicist. He was inspired by that. And he translated these physical translations into cognitive rules, the Hebb's laws, which I mentioned. And then it was possible to train such a neural network, for example, by the regular pattern here, the order of the letter A, and then by phase transition it was able to recognize in a perturbated distribution here in our checkerboard, black and white, this regular pattern. And in the neural networks, the transition is described by so-called activation neurons. And now, how to translate it into quantum physics? Very easy, because not only black and white, but in the quantum physics, in the quantum bit, we consider the continuous degrees between 0 and 1 of probabilities, more or less probable 0 and 1, and that's the quantum bit. And that is illustrated here by a so-called Bloch sphere. Bloch sphere with the poles here representing 0 and 1, and here is the pointer continuously moving, indicating the states. And then in our Hopfield system here, the checkerboards, the squares are represented, replaced by these Bloch spheres, here only in a simplified case up and down, 0 and 1, and there that means the horizontal arrow, it is a superposition with equal probability 0 and 1 that is indicated by the color gray. And so the same procedure which I mentioned before, at first the system is trained by certain regular patterns. Here may be the pattern of the letter C and I, and then by these phase transitions step by step, in the sense of the Hopfield system, now with quantum rules, the system recognizes the trained pattern. Now, that is only one layer. In deep learning, you have a neural network with several layers, and that is like the neocortex of the human brain. Here, the layers are connected with transition rules. Here in the first layer, only pixels, black and white, now also other pixels here in gray colors, and then connected as edges and corners, and then partial faces. And in the last layer here, very similar to the human brain, the recognition of a whole face. That is very simple, but in modern neural networks, which are used by VW and near to Hanover, and in car industry, automated car driving, these neural networks have not only 5 layers like in the human brain, they have hundreds, they have thousands of layers. They consist of millions of neurons, billions of weights. That is illustrated here by a network function with the input of a certain theta means the distribution of the billions of weights, and then the system, the theta distribution, is trained here to theta star. That means the network is approaching to the target function, and the target function represents the target of the system, for example, to recognize a certain pattern. Mathematically, this complex system is described by mathematics, which is well known since over 100 years, by Ludwig Boltzmann. We have the Boltzmann street here. By Boltzmann, that means statistical mechanics. It has a disadvantage: you do not know what is in detail going on here, but nevertheless the global distribution is well known, and we have a Boltzmann machinery. We call it a Boltzmann machine for this kind of stochastic network, and we can translate it also into the quantum world. Anyway, coming to my last part, that is fine, but that is simulated today on digital, conventional John von Neumann machines, computer. And with that, we will run in severe problem in the near future. Why? The von Neumann computer, Turing machine, is quite similar. The von Neumann computer strictly distinguished between processor and memory. And that means that nowadays we see increasing big data. All this data must be pressed through this bottleneck of this separation of memory and processor. And that needs enormous energy, and that needs enormous time. And so in the near future, the largest part of our energy on this world will be used by digitalization. Quite contrary, the brain. The brain, highly energetically efficient, only 20 watt. That is a small lamp. How is it possible? Because architecture is completely different. That is a network. And in each synapse, we do not need here the strict separation of processor and memory. Each synapse integrate both functions, and there is no one synapse. There are billions of synapses, so there is no danger of an von Neumann bottleneck. But these networks are still simulated on traditional digital computer in machine learning. So the question is, can we construct in hardware this kind of networks? Now that started some decades ago with a colleague who was distinguished professor here at TUM in electrotechnology, Leon Schur from UC Berkeley, and he came up with the idea to integrate in a kind of transistor the processor and the memory function, the so-called memristor. And what we did here in this book, we described mathematically. I more from the mathematical side, he more from the electrical side. We described a theory of electrotechnical networks with the memristor as a synapse to mimicking the neurochemical interaction of the brain. That is fine, and now we have a future cluster of the BMBF with the RWTH Aachen, Technical University of Dresden, and UC Berkeley working on that. And a new idea which recently came up in our group is not to consider the electronical network, but to consider a photonic network, because photons have a great advantage concerning the velocity of computing, no longer in milliseconds, electrotechnology, but in nanoseconds, and an enormous improvement concerning the energy questions. And here the neurons are replaced by optoelectronic neurons, and that is interesting for Leibniz, it is now light. The synapses, the signals are sending by light. That means by photons. And photons opens an avenue to quantum computing, because these are quantum systems, and we can introduce here all the advantages of quantum computing concerning the acceleration of computing, you know these quantum states of a photon can be integrated in so-called superpositions. That means in a package of millions of bits, and then the computational devices are applied to the whole superposition, not such as in the von Neumann computer, step by step after another. And that leads to enormous acceleration of computing. So problems which were not tractable in the time are now tractable. So neuromorphic computing and quantum computing reduce energy consumption of complex digitalization and AI. This is my last folio, Theoria cum praxi, from neuromorphic monadic systems to more efficient, faster and sustainable AI. And what I want to show you here, and what should be also be a challenge here for us, our research group here at the TUM, is how metaphysical inspiration, for example, of Leibniz, in the end can lead to revolutionary technology. Thank you very much.